All right. Hello, everyone. This is VC Uncovered, a webinar series by Uncovered Fund in collaboration with inAfrika Consulting. I am Sumiko Saito from inAfrika Consulting, and I'm the host for this episode. Our first guest is Mr. Mark Kleyner. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Sumiko.
Uncovered Fund is a venture capital for emerging markets with a mission to back untapped geniuses in the uncovered world, especially cutting-edge technology that builds industrial and social infrastructure from the ground up and empowers innovators shaping a sustainable future. Since 2021, they have invested in 9 technology startups across 18 markets in Africa and the GCC region, with covered sectors including financial services, logistics, mobility, and retail. inAfrika Consulting is studied by HEC Paris MBA candidates aiming to accelerate global investment in Africa through consulting services. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to host this very first episode. We put this webinar series together because we believe Africa's tech ecosystem has incredible stories to share with the rest of the world. The goal is to make this the most informative webinar series to tech innovation and venture investment in Africa for Japanese business audience. And in each episode, we will have a one-on-one conversation with a major player in Africa's tech ecosystem to learn more about the challenges and opportunities presented in Africa. We will learn through the lens of funds managers and investors, founders of fast-growing tech companies, global and regional corporations that work with tech startups, as well as leading accelerator programs that are empowering various stakeholders in this growing space. Now let me introduce our first guest for this webinar series. Mark Kleyner is the co-founder of Dream VC, an investor accelerator and venture capital institute focused on Africa. Under his leadership, Dream VC has facilitated the creation of numerous investment funds, even as Dream VC fellows have joined more than 70 venture capital funds, launched 4 angel networks, and established multiple syndicates. Together, these efforts currently manage more than $6.6 billion and drive growth in emerging markets. He also currently serves on multiple advisory boards for early-stage technology companies and maintains his own angel portfolio. Before founding Dream VC, Mark had various roles as a fund advisor, director, angel investor, and venture capitalist. During his venture career, he has been active in acceleration, venture building, fundraising, and direct investment work at 5 global venture capital funds. So thank you very much again. I'm very curious about your recent professional experiences, but before starting the main part, I'd like to ask you about yourself. Could you tell us about your background before your venture capital career?
Okay, thank you, Sumiko, for the question, and thank you for a strong introduction. Almost weird to hear myself being introduced by somebody else, but always a pleasure to be on a podcast as strong as this one. So on my end, what should I say? I'm originally from Eastern Europe. I'm actually based in the UK, and I've had a relatively interesting background that has spanned consulting, startup work, venture capital, venture building, and now venture education. I think before the venture capital transition, my career can really be summed up as a combination of initially management and strategy consulting, a transition very quickly into digital consultancy, where I grew to a partner level role over the course of a short period of time, and then my first foray into the startup space. I think that first foray into startups actually even started for me quite early on at the end of my university career. I studied up at Edinburgh University in the UK, and I was always quite curious about how startups were different from substantially larger multinational businesses. I didn't have that experience directly from the consulting world, but once I started to move away from management consulting into digital consultancy, I started to see the overlap with where startup consulting work could be really exciting. And then actually the very first startup I worked with was a food tech business in alternative foods that taught me a little bit about how important it is to grow super early on if you want to be venture backed. That business is now doing very well. And the second business I got to work in was a last mile logistics company that would grow on to be acquired by a unicorn in Asia. So I was very, very excited to get some very positive experience, perhaps, in the first forays into startups. And those first few forays then opened up the doors for me to go startup to startup to startup, jumping between operator and growth roles before finally ending up in a venture studio, which would then signal my transition into the venture capital space.
Thank you very much. I can imagine like your background was already very international and diverse, both in terms of career and also geography. And now I'd like to know about your experience in VC and PE, and also what brought you to Africa.
Yeah, so I think as you mentioned in the introduction, I've had the benefit, or I guess privilege, of having worked in a number of different venture capital funds at a very early age. And that's something that I definitely don't consider entirely to be purely on skill alone. I think definitely there was a combination of luck in that too. Over the course of the last few years, I've had the experiences of working for an early stage US tech fund, working for a generalist European VC fund connected to a venture studio, working with the B2B enterprise software as a service, a Central and Eastern European fund, a Web3 focused US fund, a deep tech AI and healthcare fund, and working at the founding team of a startup accelerator, growing that from scratch to support a portfolio of more than 25 different companies, a number of which would grow on to be successful. I think if I had to sum up that career jump, I think in retrospect, it definitely wasn't one that was immediately informed from the beginning by a direction that I knew where I was going. I think really starting off in VC, to be perfectly honest, I had really no idea what I was doing. I thought startups were really exciting. I thought supporting startups with growth and operations was really exciting. And then when I had a chance to first work in a venture studio, an environment where you build multiple different startups, one after the other, I thought that was already what I want to do for the rest of my life. And then it so happened that the venture studio I was working with was affiliated with a fund, and I was pulled into the fund team. And I realized that there was something I found really, really exciting about not just building something that's really interesting, but potentially identifying people who are really the outliers in society that might build something truly phenomenal that both changes the world as we know it, changes how we interact with the world, but also potentially changes people's lives. And funding those people seemed like something that was even better than just the pure kind of consulting, problem solving piece of the work I'd had before and the startup side. So I jumped into VC initially, completely assuming that any VC is exciting. And to anyone listening, I would definitely say take the time to think like why VC is what you want to do. Because the very first fund I invested in was entirely agnostic, investing both in tech-enabled businesses and non-tech-enabled businesses. And I was expected to actively travel around the world, speak multiple different languages, including ones that I hadn't spoken before I joined the fund. So I had to learn them on the job. And at the same point, also figure out how to invest in sectors where I didn't even know what the startup was doing, let alone whether they were doing a good job or a bad job. So definitely VC was a little bit of a learning curve. And I think that probably informed why I jumped fund to fund to fund, looking for a thesis or perhaps a focus for a fund that really worked. I came to appreciate that in the course of moving between these different funds, something that I realized I ended up being quite good at is beyond just the pure play investment work. I realized I was actually quite good on the fundraising side of supporting funds with their GP/LP relationships and helping them access more capital into the fund. And I realized I really enjoyed the portfolio or so-called VC platform side. So building that out for funds when they didn't have a platform strategy was something that I started to get good at. And after working at my second fund, where already I knew what I was doing, I was already coming in with some context of the sectors I was looking to invest in. From that point onwards, I would then focus in on my strengths, fundraising and building out that piece, platform and building out that piece. And then on the investment side, I would just go with the flow of whatever the fund was looking to invest in. So that worked relatively well for a couple of years. And then I had a bit of a urge to perhaps push myself a bit more. And the connection to Africa actually came from a combination of things. One, I already mentioned I was born in an emerging market, and I've always wanted to work in emerging markets or developing economies where I think the impact of your work can go much further. I think you can change a lot more around you, both commercially and from an impactful point of view, if you work in a market where there simply aren't enough people building for a core problem. It's not a matter of are you the best fintech, it's more a question of are you the only fintech? And if you're the only fintech, then the onus on you, your responsibility is to both do something really meaningful, but also to be a commercial success. Because if you fail at one or the other, you will be criticized for a generation to come. So I actually like that. I like the adrenaline that comes with being first in market. I like the thought of building something that's not been built before. I like the idea of constantly challenging myself to work with different working cultures. And I got a bit to experience a bit of that because early on in my career, I was working with many Southeast Asian businesses that were expanding into Europe. So I got to experience both European working cultures, West, Central, and Eastern, and Southeast Asian working cultures. And then one of the companies I was working with, a fund that was affiliated with a number of last mile logistics investments in Southeast Asia, had also been active investing in e-commerce and last mile logistics in West Africa. So when my team moved from the divisions focused on Southeast Asia to look at Africa, I had already got a little bit of a taste of what was going on in the African ecosystem in about 2017. And I thought that was really, really exciting. But at the time, I just didn't have any role to give me that opportunity. So skip forward a few years, now worked across a couple of different VC funds. Now I think I know what I'm doing. And then a colleague of mine who was building out a early stage startup consultancy slash an accelerator that was working with very early stage tech businesses, comes in and says they want to hand off their directorship to somebody else, and they're looking to bring in somebody to manage that role. And I thought, this is perfect. So there's a bit of consulting work involved. I know how to do that. There's a bit of acceleration work involved. I know how to do that. You have to think like a VC to find really scalable businesses and support them very early on. And at the same time, this gives me the Africa exposure I want without being full-time. So that company was called Mizizi, and that was my transition into African markets. Joining that accelerator, taking it on, was also the point where, for the first time, I got to co-build together with my future co-founder, Cindy I, who's now my co-founder at Dream VC. She also joined as a director. We both applied for the same role, and ironically, they couldn't select between the two of us. So we both ended up joining as co-directors for this accelerator. We worked with that for about 2 years, had a really positive experience, and realized that most likely we want to work in African markets in the long term.
Thank you very much. Just to imagine the sceneries can excite me a lot. And yeah, I wanted to ask you the details about how you studied Dream VC. But do you have anything to add, or?
Yeah, so I think this is something that we get asked, both me and my co-founder, quite often, because it was definitely a little bit of a serendipitous decision, in the sense that starting Dream VC for us didn't come in with a very long-term plan that this is what we want to do and this is how we will do it and this is where it will go. It was more so a response to a problem that we'd faced. So I mentioned that we were running this early stage startup consultancy slash startup accelerator. Well, that accelerator's funding ended after a certain period of time, and we needed to think about what the team that had worked with us would be doing. And when we were working at this accelerator, one of the ways we were contributing to our team, beyond just giving them exciting projects to work on in a good work environment, was also upskilling them. So we would hire teams only based in African markets or including young graduates from outside of Africa who wanted to work in African markets. We would have this predominantly, let's say, under 26, under 27 age team working with these startups in every startup that was involved in the cohort. We ran 3 or 4 cohorts from memory. Now, for those teams, most of them had a bit of experience in something else, maybe a little bit of finance experience, a bit of consulting, a bit of tech experience, but usually no VC experience. VC often being a postgraduate career, it was unlikely that many of them would have had any prior experience with startups. So what we would do is, as they were working with these startups, we would also teach them, how do you think like a VC analyst or associate? How do you look at deals? How do you separate strong deals from poorer deals? And how do you apply an additional filter of doing that in very challenging markets? So we were on one hand teaching them, and on the other hand teaching ourselves how to teach them in the process. So we kind of had to do that because we wanted to make sure that our teams were actually very efficient, and they were. But then the accelerator ended, and we were worried that all of these individuals who had suddenly had this really cool experience working for an international accelerator across multiple different African countries, who had a presence in Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda, South Africa, and a few other markets, we weren't sure what else they would do immediately after that. the ecosystem was still really picking up, and there weren't that many funds that had an opportunity for you to travel around, cover multiple different markets. So we thought we should give them more upskilling, so then if there are any people who could hire them, in theory, they will use those skills. And we did. We spent maybe 2-3 weeks just training our former staff, and then 100% of them landed roles in VC or PE focused on African markets. So we thought, oh, this is interesting. We just helped them for a couple of weeks, and the goal was more so just to ensure that they don't stay unemployed. But they didn't just not stay unemployed. They actually went ahead and landed direct roles in the venture capital, private equity, or startup ecosystem. So they immediately put that into practice. And for us, that suggested two things. One, that training people for VC can work, something that I'd never really thought could work. And two, it told us that actually a lot of African funds need talent on the ground. And that's something that remained somewhat unsaid until a couple of years later. So then we sat down and we thought, what do we want to do next? Cindy on her end could go back to the US and resume her career as a VC there. Me on my end, I could go back to the UK or Europe and resume my career there. But we had been really inspired by working with some of the early stage African founders, and we thought that the ecosystem could still use a lot more work. So what did we decide to do? Well, we looked at how could VC education work? And both Cindy and I had seen initiatives called VC fellowships that had really started off in the US, which were initially programs run by funds to allow individuals from an untraditional career like academia to transition into VC by first experiencing work with a VC fund, almost like an extern of sorts, with a little bit of educational components. So we reached out to pretty much every fund we'd ever worked with. On Cindy's end, that was a number of funds across the US and Asia. On my end, that was funds in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And we spoke with all of them, and we co-developed with them the initial kind of program, almost like a test to see if we can actually repeat the success of this initial few former employees and train people. We then said we'd do an open call. We had no funds for this, so we just put some initial angel money into it as co-founders. We didn't even fully incorporate the company. We just said this is going to be a part-time thing. We're going to take a short sabbatical from VC and angel investing and acceleration and just do this as a way of contributing back to the space. We set up the program. We did a call on LinkedIn for applications. We had no idea what we were doing. And I think a week later, we had something like 400, 500 applicants coming in from all different parts, mostly of Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, who sometimes had heard about our alumni or about our startups and wanted to be VCs as well. And we thought, wow. So actually, a lot of people want to work in the VC space in Africa, and a lot more than people are thinking. We then went to most VC funds we knew, and we said, okay, so are you guys actually looking to hire? And most of them said, we can't find anybody interested in our fund in Nairobi. We can't find anybody in Kigali, in Cape Town, in Lagos, in Cairo. No one wants to work for our fund. So we had, on one hand, a lot of people that wanted to work for VCs, and we had a lot of VCs that couldn't find talent, which was a very interesting connection. So we thought, should we do a talent matching or should we do something more like a fellowship? But we didn't really want to build a startup. We wanted to build something that we could actually relate to. So we built a program with an idea that if someone was building a fund that's going to be an African fund, or they're building an international fund that wants to hire an African team locally, what would they want in an analyst or an associate? That's where we started. And that's how Dream VC really started, with initially a fellowship program that then spun into a more comprehensive and a more comprehensive and a more comprehensive fellowship. And now that ended up almost like an academic program end to end, in what is now a very intensive, hands-on kind of applied venture capital training, taking an individual from no experience, but with a really strong passion for African markets, all the way through to the point where, in our opinion, they are an ideal analyst or associate to hire. And that was just the beginning, of course.
Thank you very much. It's been really, really interesting. And yeah, I want to learn about the institution and the programs you run. And I'd like you to elaborate on the types of people who you think can be good VCs and what Illumina tend to do post-program as well. You're muted.
Thank you. So I think firstly on the Institute side, we've now evolved into being a little bit more comprehensive. So it's been a couple of years. We're now celebrating our 3rd and a half, maybe 4th year since foundation. And we've now evolved from just being a fellowship that was targeting these young professionals to now having multiple different interventions that support the entire venture capital ecosystem, really end to end. On one hand, we still run our flagship Launch into Venture Capital Fellowship that helps individuals who want to join early stage careers or join junior careers in the venture capital space in Africa to get started with that transition. We then, since our second year, launched a senior program, which we call the Investor Accelerator, that supports individuals who might already be investors or who already experienced executives, who already have management experience, often 5, 6 to 15 years plus experience in another industry, but who don't want to go through an MBA or an EMBA to then restart their career to first go into VC. For many of them, often because they're so senior in their career, they want to find a way to do almost like a crash course into VC. And that's exactly what we provide, covering also the components of angel investing, venture debt, startup acceleration, venture building, everything. So then they have the optionality to go into that using the Dream VC program as justification for that career conversion. So junior program and senior program. Then on the B2B side, we've started to also train VC funds as an institution. We realize that there's a gap between the VC and their LP. Often limited partners want to give VCs money, but they also expect VCs to actively upskill themselves. But there's not that many options for VCs in emerging markets to actually upskill themselves, which is affordable and also doesn't take up too much time. That's why we develop both online and in-person trainings, and now we run those for dozens of funds across Africa every year, both for international funds and domestic funds. And finally, the last piece of the puzzle, which I don't think is the last one forever, but the last one for now, is that we realized about a year and a half ago that for many African funds, a big issue beyond just finding talent and a big issue beyond being able to professionalize and compete against other funds on an institutional level was also actually being able to find follow-on capital. At the moment, most African funds are very early stage. And what happens is when you reach Series A as a startup or Series B as a startup, you only have about 10 African funds that can actually give you capital. That's nowhere near sustainable for a continent of 1.5 billion people, right? You need to have a lot more growth funds. But you can only do that by either creating a lot more LPs, which I think will take a lot more coordinated work from the entire ecosystem, or creating more growth stage investors. And we're focusing on that latter piece by actually now training corporates as well. We help big corporations, both domestic African corporations and international corporations, understand what venture capital looks like and train them to think like a venture capitalist. So that instead of just trusting that somebody else will always manage their money like a big private equity fund or hedge fund, we teach them to get excited about VC and to start investing like a VC. That means giving money to earlier stage VCs, investing alongside those VCs, and investing after those VCs to hopefully create more continuity. So that's really the institution and the programs we run, right? The junior, the senior, the fund training, and the CVC enablement. As for the type of people, I think it depends on each program. So what we normally say is, of course, easiest way to understand this is just to, of course, check out our kind of programs on the website with the brochures we have. But for the junior programs, the launch into VC, this is often individuals who are making a transition from a couple of years of operator experience or maybe a fantastic academic career into their first job in VC. So what we normally say is you might have anywhere from perhaps 1 to 5 or 6 years experience professionally, but then you might be bringing that willingness to do whatever it takes to really come in and be focused on investing in the continent for the next 10 years of your professional career. When we look at individuals like that, we think that they might be a good fit, and then we run them through a 4-stage application process to determine if that's actually the case. For the senior program, we normally look for individuals that have proven to us that they are an experienced growth operator. They are, for example, a founder who's had a successful exit and therefore now is sitting on some money that they can invest. They are already doing something in the ecosystem, like heading up an entrepreneurship support organization, say an incubator, accelerator, or hub, or maybe they are already on the senior position, like a VP, for example, at a corporate, and they have the network and reach to do something. Now, we want those senior participants, the individuals that go into the senior program, to then leverage their network and the network of all of their peers to build something together. And that's what we see happen, right? So we always look for individuals who both bring something to the table to any fund that they would join, because they have to if they don't have those 5, 10 years of VC experience to supplement it with something else. But we also look to see how can they contribute to everybody else in the network. And something that's been really beautiful is that among a number of our fellows in the past who have had completely different experiences, say somebody who had grown up in Cote d'Ivoire and studied in Canada and worked abroad, and somebody else who'd grown up in Kenya and now works in South Africa, they meet at the program and they actually realize the interests are very aligned. But both geographically, culturally, linguistically, they would have never met and had no reason to meet other than because of this program. So those serendipitous meetups that many VCs say are like one of the fun things about the industry, I think we're definitely accelerating a lot of those. And that's something that I think it's always great to see our fellows always being very enthusiastic about.
I can easily imagine your programs have been really successful. And I'm very curious how you attract a lot of participants and impact the ecosystem. There may be typical so-called startup accelerators in Africa, and I want to know the characteristics of your program as an investor accelerator and how does that help the startup space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing in terms of how we attract people is being very transparent. So our programs aren't hidden in terms of who's teaching at the programs and what we're teaching. We realize that there's a lot of gatekeeping in VC. So if we have a whole brand around trying to make VC more accessible, especially to individuals from a myriad of different backgrounds, that means we should really talk the talk or walk the walk, as they say. So number one, whenever we have any programs, we actually announce what we're going to be covering. We announce the agenda, we announce the curriculum in advance. So then individuals who actually know what they want can go on the program and see, okay, this is what I'm going to be studying. It's not going to be a broad module on leadership. It's going to be this that will help me with constructing my team, this that will help me in selecting investments, this that will help me with due diligence, and this that will help me with closing a deal, for example. All of our programs are very applied. So almost all of our staff, I think 95%, don't have an academic background. And anybody that does have an academic background also has industry experience. So the prerequisite is that anybody that comes in to deliver parts of our programs has to have actually worked through what they're teaching in the past. If someone's covering acceleration, we bring in a great accelerator manager or someone like from our backgrounds or our team who's previously managed an accelerator. If we're talking about venture capital, we are sharing our experiences of work in the venture capital space. Venture platform, our experiences of venture platform. So we don't reach out to, for example, purely academic staff or purely research staff. We want people to learn from others who they want to be in a few years. And then if they learn experientially through the words, through the stories, through the case studies of someone who's been there, often you end up picking up tricks that are, I guess, quick to learn if you know what you're looking for, but that you wouldn't even know were important. I think that piece of the applicable learnings, the pretty comprehensive curriculum, and the quality of the speakers has always attracted people year on year. But the biggest thing is just the alumni network itself. Something that I think, Sumiko, you might relate to is that many amazing business schools around the world have done a fantastic job in building out alumni networks. But broadly speaking, if you are not within that alumni network of a business school, it's quite difficult to connect with other peers or professionals in the space. And even if you are, for example, part of the HBS alumni or LBS or HEC alumni, it'll be difficult to connect to somebody outside of your alumni network in another space. And what we want to do is to create almost an alumni network for African VCs so that they have something that they have in common. Because if they have no professional reason to keep in touch, at least they should have a personal reason to keep in touch. And that's what we are trying to give them. And I think that camaraderie or community piece has helped to maintain the loyalty of our alumni over the few years. What's really satisfying to see from, I guess, an organizer or facilitator point of view is that we've now had about 250 fellows come in through our programs, and less than 2 or 3 of them are no longer in touch with us. So pretty much 99% are still in touch with us on a monthly basis. That tells us that they had a good experience and they're in touch with the other parts of their community. And that, I think, is a strong point. Coming back finally to your last point of how does that help startups? Well, most startup accelerators help a startup to go from point A to point B much faster. That's their point, right? They accelerate a startup's trajectory in an early stage. For us, we see us almost like a career accelerator because we help an individual investor or a venture capital fund to go from point A to point B faster. Except we don't do that by just giving them money. That's maybe what an LP would do. Instead, we say that how can we make sure that without us, you can raise your fund 2, fund 3, fund 4, fund 5? How can we make sure that without us, you can have a really strong fund team that doesn't need any help from any other consultants? How can we make sure that when you, as an African fund or Southeast Asian fund or Latin American fund, compete with an enormous fund, for example, from China or the US or the UK, how can you stand out when you're approaching a pension fund? And we do that by capacity building. So I think that's the main focus. What's similar to us and accelerators in general is we all focus on capacity building, but they focus on capacity building for startups, and we focus on capacity building for investors. And by making investors stronger, more connected, and more capacitated, that means that they can then invest more money on a faster basis and more consistently into the African ecosystem. That broadly then helps the startup ecosystem grow. I think you mentioned the last point I'll say is that you mentioned we have about $6.5 billion that's managed directly or indirectly by our alumni now that's focused in Africa. Out of those 6.5 billion, just a few years ago, all of those funds were not looking at Africa, or the majority of them had less than $1 billion combined between them. So that's $5 or $6 billion that previously wasn't looking at Africa that's been reoriented to look at the startup space. So I guess the biggest thing is getting better investors in the space and creating a lot more capital to back their startups.
It's kind of very understandable that so many people want to learn from you. And yeah, about the investment environment, I think there are different types of investors, such as angels, independent venture capital, and corporate venture capital. And especially, the Japanese investment environment is characterized by active corporate venture capital. So I'm curious how they can collaborate with African businesses. And do you think corporations can also be a good VCs in the context of Africa?
Oh, very interesting question. I think this is particularly interesting because it stems directly and reminds me directly of a collaboration that DreamVC actually did with Uncovered Fund around hosting a Showcase Africa conference in Japan earlier this year. I think what's really interesting about Japanese corporate investments and the Japanese investment environment in general is that while it's true that often it is a little bit slower than perhaps the European or US ecosystem in making decisions or changing their investment mandates to look at something entirely new, they are also much more patient in testing out an investment approach. And something that has been a great example of that is Japanese investment in Southeast Asia and in India. If you go back about 50 years, most Japanese corporates had limited interest or investment activities outside of Japan, looking at Southeast Asia or India. But then you skip forward to the 2000s, and there are more than 200 corporates that are actively either investing, co-building, building startups on their own, or funding startups in India and Southeast Asia. In fact, Japanese investment is the biggest influence alongside Chinese investment in that region. And that is entirely offshore investments, sometimes strategic, sometimes financial. So there's definitely a large corporate investment world in Japan. That's number one. Number two, what's really interesting is that at the same time as there being a large corporate investment piece, the early stage startup ecosystem in Japan at the moment is not as robust and doesn't have as high levels of entrepreneurship as you see in emerging markets. So while in India, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa, you see very, very high rates of entrepreneurship, the highest in the world, among many parts of the developing world, because of the security of a professional career or corporate career or just general societal standards, most people will not go and build a startup. If you have the option of working in a bank or an accountancy firm or consulting firm in the UK or France or the US or even Japan, why would you go to a startup if you have that option? In comparison, if you don't have the stability of a corporate career, often needs-based entrepreneurship drives a larger rate of that social entrepreneurship that we see really bustling everywhere across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and especially in African markets. So coming back to African businesses, I think Japanese corporates have a number of different things to offer. Number one, they have their international expertise. The oldest businesses in the world, the most stable businesses in the world are predominantly Japanese. I recall a study, I think, by Jetro or JICA suggested that close to 40% of all the businesses around the world globally who are more than 200 years old all came from Japan. That speaks to the fact that Japanese businesses understand long-term thinking. They understand long-term thinking very, very well, and they can have the patience to invest in Africa's development, however long that would take. That's number one. That makes them unique as an investor, even more long-term thinking than the developmental players from Europe or the US, and definitely much more long-term thinking than most private sector investors that are international investing in Africa today. Now, why is that good? Most African businesses need a long time to mature. They need time to go past the market barriers. They need patience to go through the nuances and challenges of expanding across the continent. And when they have that time, the liquidity options can be fantastic. You see some of the earliest African businesses built in 2005, 2008, 2010 from the tech space exiting now. So they needed 10 to 15 years. For a typical VC, they can't afford to wait for that. But for a CVC that doesn't have a 5 or 10-year mandate, that can sit on an investment for longer and be more patient, that's perfect. That's number one. That patience is a really big factor. Governance is a second factor. Japanese corporates are known for being very strong in corporate governance. It's one of the reasons why Japanese corporates are often seen as a good acquirer for international companies, and why you've seen so many acquisitions of both American companies, European companies, and Asian companies by Japanese conglomerates. Now, what Japanese corporates can bring to African scale-ups or established businesses is to strategically acquire them bring in the governance standards and expertise of those Japanese corporates while also keeping the underlying business inherently African. What that could do to an African business is it could give them an alternative to going to the US or Europe or the Middle East for money, which at the moment are still overwhelmingly the only options that African businesses know about. And it could allow Japanese strategic interests to grow substantially in Africa. So number one, the patient capital point is an advantage. Number two, that board experience and acquisition experience is an advantage. And number three comes back to just the core operations of many Japanese businesses. If you look at how competitive almost any sector is in Japan, you have a very large number of banks, regionally, on a national level, and on an international level. You look at the energy sector, incredibly competitive. You look at fast-moving consumer goods, incredibly competitive. In fact, building a new corporate in Japan would probably be one of the hardest places in the world to compete because there's so many established players. But then when you look at investing in African markets, there's a huge blue ocean opportunity. Multiple countries do not have a market leader. They do not have a strong presence from an international player, and often they don't have anti-monopolistic controls. What that means is an international company can come in and build almost monopolistic control of a market with strong multi-decade control of an economy. That kind of approach could be a very good opportunity for Japanese corporates who are seeing perhaps poorer performance back home or don't have growth opportunities in East Asia to expand into Africa, where that growth opportunity is very much a Wild West. So I think across all of those points, Japanese corporates have a lot to offer. And that comes back to answering hopefully your last point as well. Could they be good VCs? I think they can. I think the nuance is that in the past, most people have made a case that for international corporate, the way you should invest in African markets is only twofold. Either give money to an African-focused fund or to buy companies. I don't think those are the two options. I think you have three options. Your option number one is, yes, give money to an African-focused fund. That is always a good approach because that way you can understand what they are doing and learn from them. Coming in as an LP is always a good experience for a new investor. Number two, acquiring opportunities is still very much there. There's a lot of acquisition opportunities for Japanese businesses to invest in Africa, especially now when market valuations have actually decreased. Historically, this is the best time to buy. But the third point that most people forget is it's actually great to build in-house CVC expertise. If a corporate builds in-house CVC expertise, that ensures that they have sustainability for the next 10 to 20 years. If they give money to a VC fund and it works, and the VC fund returns their money, the corporate might not have learned anything from that VC fund, depending on the relationship. In some cases, they will, in some cases, they won't. If they simply acquired companies, they've been doing what they've been doing well for the last 100 years. That's fine. But to really make sure that their investment activity stays the same or gets better year after year after year, there should be some combination of these outward-facing activities where the corporate interacts with another company, but also inwards-facing innovation, where you have an internal team, whether Japanese or international, ideally mixed, that is actually investing in African markets, hopefully based somewhere closer to African markets than Japan, and acts almost like the first experiment for a corporate to see whether a company is a potentially good investment acquisition opportunity or whether a company could be good to partner with before the entire corporate comes in and changes the entire structure to partner with that startup. So I think that approach of being almost a VC internally as a CVC can really work. And that's something we've obviously, quite biased on because we've committed a substantial amount of time to support other corporates in doing that. But I think, yes, corporates can be good VCs in the context of Africa, and I think Japanese corporates especially have a lot to offer.
Thank you very much. It's really, really interesting insight. And yeah, I was going to ask you about your experience in working with corporates, but do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, I think I pretty much mentioned the point of what we do with corporates today. We help corporations to design what their corporate venturing might look like. So we speak with the corporate team, often with the board, and we identify who within your teams is actually a good fit to potentially be involved in its dedicated innovation unit. And if you have an innovation unit, what can you be doing better? After we do that initial framework, we call that CVC design, we then go into the CVC training, where we have a dedicated multi-month training. It can be both remote or in person, where we essentially train a team of individuals, and we specifically say we train individuals in-house, internally inside the corporate. So then the corporate has expertise in-house, and then they can hire external managers or external staff to complement that in-house expertise. With those internally trained staff and the externally trained staff, we then help the corporate build a CVC unit and get that started. Our goal is not to be an external fund manager. I think my goal is that we can get a number of corporates every single year to the point where they are as proficient as a venture capital fund. If they are as proficient as a venture capital fund, they won't need us anymore. So making us not necessary is one part of our training actually working. And whenever we see someone that comes to us and says, everything is working, we're very, very satisfied. So that's our experience working with corporates, mostly around helping them develop that open innovation corporate venturing strategy, but then also actually helping them build the CVC and launch the CVC, providing any advice or sometimes sitting on the investment committees or advisory boards if necessary to make sure that the CVC actually works.
Thank you very much. It's actually very interesting comments. And yeah, lastly, could you give me any advice on how to build compelling cases for more investment in Africa? Like investment in this context can be both about direct investment or investment in funds as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, when we talk about building a compelling case for investing in Africa, you have to think about what are you investing in and who are you, right? So this is like two foundational questions based on what you are investing in, what's compelling will be different. For example, if you are investing in impactful ventures, you will look for a couple of different signals that will suggest that this venture can be innately impactful. On the flip side, if you are an impact fund, but you might not only be investing in impactful ventures, then the way you invest would be a little bit different. So this is kind of like the first step, I would say, when you're building out any compelling narrative. It's think, what are you investing in? And then who are you? Then when you're building out that narrative specifically for African markets, you have a number of different options. I say this with a touch of sarcasm because most VC funds follow a similar fundraising strategy. If they're an African VC, when they're raising money, most African VCs raise at least a bit of capital from outside Africa. And what many of them do is they focus on a couple of things. Number one are the macroeconomic tailwinds. Africa's population is growing. It's growing very, very rapidly. And by most estimates, it will account from anywhere from a quarter to a third of the global population over the next 30 years. That is a demographic dividend that is most likely going to yield a very large B2C market when that market is eventually able to purchase products, but also a very, very large B2B2C market when you sell to domestic businesses or with domestic businesses that sell on customized pricing to that local majority. That's number one. So building a demographic dividend argument is focusing on the macroeconomics of African markets, focusing on what's looking very good and what currently doesn't work in African markets that can be changed. Remember that as a venture capitalist, your main point is not looking for a market where everything is working well, because then we have nothing to add. The venture capitalist likes markets that don't work well, because that asymmetry between what is currently exists and what is possible, that's the value that we're going to capture as a VC. So look for the big core fundamental challenges and the big core fundamental advantages of Africa and make that macroeconomic argument. That's option one. Option two is think about the impact you can achieve in most African markets. What I often tell individuals that are perhaps doubtful about the impactfulness of African businesses or African charities or nonprofits is I tell them that naturally venture capital investing and early stage investing in most African businesses, in more than half of them, will have a pretty high impact multiple. If you invest in another CRM company that happens to try and compete with HubSpot and Salesforce and Pipedrive in New York, you are not actually creating direct social impact. You might be creating a little bit of economic impact, but no social impact unless you get very, very large. In comparison, if you create the only CRM company that helps 100,000 or 10,000 small businesses go from paper bookkeeping to digital bookkeeping and often grow their revenues by 50 to 150% as a result, you're creating an economic benefit that's very tangible, and that's proven as an example. I've used an example of a company that's done exactly that in African markets, but also you have a huge economic impact from an economic social point of view, a socioeconomic impact, because anytime you create impact among these family-owned businesses or these small businesses, they hire more people, impact on jobs. They hire individuals often that are unemployed rather than people from other jobs, so creation of new jobs. And then they actually help to build a family unit's sustainability and livelihood. So there's a very, very visible impact to what you do. I think in that sense, building out a macroeconomic argument or an impact argument on what you can achieve are two of the biggest arguments. But beyond that, there's a whole range of other cases you can make. I guess the biggest one I would say is think about where African markets are today and think about what we've seen has worked in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and in other developing markets. Now, if we have anything to learn, it's that to some extent, history does repeat itself. So if we can take some learnings from being the first investors in India and the first investors in Southeast Asia and the first investors in Latin America, yeah, I think it would be a good strategy to be among the first investors in African markets as well.
Thank you very, very much. It's been really interesting and fruitful conversation. We have come to the conclusion of the first episode now. And after this episode, we can certainly look forward to more of these conversations. Today, we introduced Mark from Dream VC, an investor accelerator and venture capital institute focused on Africa, and we learned how this helps the investment ecosystem. We also learned about how corporate venture capital plays an important role in the African market and how we can build compelling cases in Africa. Hope these insights will help you in Japanese markets expand into the African market. And it was also interesting to hear about the programs you run in detail. I'm happy to share this opportunity for Japanese markets. For anyone interested in signing up for their training, upskilling yourself, or growing as an African-focused investor, you can find out more about Dream VC on their website or LinkedIn, where they regularly share information about their venture capital and corporate venture capital training and more. It was very nice to talk with you. Thank you very much for your time and wisdom. We appreciate the work you're doing in educating and empowering the next generation of VCs in Africa. And thank you very much for everyone for listening. See you next time.